The morning sun peeked through the windows of the Golden Cup diner as Maya wiped down the counters, humming softly to herself. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air while early birds trickled in for their breakfast. She'd been doing this job for 3 years now, and her hands moved with practiced ease as she set up for another busy day. "Order up," called out Uncle Joe from the kitchen, his cheerful voice mixing with the clinking of plates and murmurs of sleepy customers. Maya grabbed the plates, balancing them along her arm with the grace of a dancer. As she moved between tables, her quiet humming turned to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a habit that helped her remember which customer ordered what. The regulars had gotten used to her gentle humming. Old Mrs. Kumar, who always sat by the window with her morning tea, would smile and tap her finger against her cup in rhythm. The construction workers from the site down the street would pause their loud chatter when they caught bits of Mozart or Bach floating through the air. But none of them knew that just 2 years ago, Maya's fingers hadn't been wrapped around coffee pots and notepads. They'd been dancing across piano keys at one of the country's top music schools. The same fingers that now served plates of pancakes and scrambled eggs had once played in concert halls, drawing tears from audiences with their delicate touch. Life had other plans, though. When her grandmother fell ill, Maya didn't think twice about coming home. Being the eldest meant something in her family, and with her parents working double shifts to keep up with the medical bills, someone had to be there for her younger brothers. The diner job was supposed to be temporary, just something to help with the bills while she figured things out. "Hey dreamer, table 5 needs more coffee." Uncle Joe's voice snapped her back to reality. Maya blinked, realizing she'd been lost in thought while refilling sugar dispensers. She quickly grabbed the coffee pot, but didn't stop humming. The music in her head was the one thing she'd never give up, even if she couldn't play anymore. As the morning rush picked up, Maya moved through the diner like she was conducting an orchestra. Dodge the swinging kitchen door, slide past Jimmy the cook, twirl around Mrs. Kumar's extended cane, all while keeping the coffee pot steady and the orders straight. Her mother used to say Maya had music in her bones. Now she used that rhythm to dance through her shifts instead of across piano keys. Some days were harder than others. Like when she'd catch a classical piece playing on the radio and her fingers would twitch, remembering the feel of cool ivory under them. Or when she'd see posters for concerts at the local theater and remember how it felt to sit on that stage. But Maya had learned to find music in different places, in the sizzle of bacon on the grill, in the symphony of morning conversation, in the perfect timing needed to serve 5 tables at once. Uncle Joe watched her from behind the counter, pretending to be focused on his crossword puzzle. He'd hired her on the spot 3 years ago, recognizing something special in the quiet girl with tired eyes. He never pushed her to talk about the past she was clearly carrying, but he noticed how she came alive when music played in the diner, how her movements changed from tired to graceful the moment a tune started. The morning sun climbed higher, and Maya's world narrowed to the rhythm of the diner. Pour, serve, clear, repeat. But today felt different somehow. There was a whisper of change in the air, mixing with the coffee steam and breakfast smells. Maya couldn't know it yet, but life was about to play an unexpected note in her carefully constructed melody. The old upright piano arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, squeezed through the diner's front door by 2 movers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Uncle Joe had bought it at an estate sale, saying the place needed a little something extra for the evening crowd. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she first saw it. Standing there in the corner like a piece of her past had somehow wandered into her present. "It's nothing fancy," Uncle Joe said, running his hand along the wooden surface, "but it'll do for some dinner music." He didn't notice how Maya's hands trembled slightly as she wiped down nearby tables, her eyes drawn to the instrument like a magnet. The piano quickly became part of the diner's charm. During the evening shift, local amateur musicians would stop by, filling the air with everything from choppy versions of Heart and Soul to enthusiastic but messy renditions of pop songs. Some were better than others, but all of them brought something new to the usual diner atmosphere. There was the retired mailman who played old country songs, his fingers stiff but determined. The high school student who practiced her beginner's pieces during the slow afternoon hours, apologizing for every mistake. The young businessman who'd bang out show tunes after a rough day at the office, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. Maya watched them all from behind her serving tray, sometimes wincing internally at wrong notes, other times smiling at their genuine joy in making music. Her fingers would often twitch at her sides, mentally correcting their mistakes, playing along with ghost keys in the air as she moved between tables. "You ever play?" Uncle Joe asked her one quiet afternoon, catching her staring at the piano while restocking sugar packets. Maya just shook her head, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. But it was easier than explaining why she wouldn't, play anymore. The weight of her family's needs felt heavier than all the piano keys combined. The regulars started timing their visits around the informal performances. Mrs. Kumar would linger over her evening tea when the mailman was scheduled to play. The construction workers would drop in after their shift when the businessman was likely to appear, requesting their favorite Broadway numbers with their dessert orders. But it was the silence between performances that got to Maya the most. During those moments, the piano stood there like an unopened gift, its potential hanging in the air. Sometimes, during her closing shifts, she'd catch herself walking toward it, drawn by some invisible force. She'd get close enough to smell the faint scent of wood polish and aged ivory before pulling herself back to reality. One evening, a little girl in a pink dress walked up to the piano while her parents finished their meal. She pressed a single key, the note ringing clear and true through the diner. The sound hit Maya like a physical thing, bringing back memories of her first piano lesson, of tiny fingers stretching to reach the right keys, of her grandmother's proud smile as she mastered her first simple tune. "Play something else, sweetie," the girl's mother called out, but Maya had already moved to distract her with a free cookie. She couldn't bear to hear another note right then, not when the music in her head was so loud it almost drowned out the everyday sounds of the diner. That night, as Maya cleaned the keys with gentle, knowing movements, the kind that come from years of caring for an instrument, she hummed softly to herself. The tune was something new, not classical or pop, but a melody that seemed to capture the bittersweet feeling of standing at a crossroads, of watching others do the thing you love most in the world while you stay silent. Uncle Joe pretended to be busy with the receipts, but he noticed everything. He saw how she cleaned the piano with the care of someone who knew its worth, how her humming matched perfectly with the last song played, how her eyes held a story she wasn't ready to tell. He'd learned long ago that some instruments needed time to warm up before they could play their best music. Maybe, he thought, the same was true for people. Every morning at exactly 7:15, Mr. Lee would walk through the diner's door, his silver hair neatly combed and his worn leather briefcase tucked under his arm. He always sat at the same corner table, ordered the same breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee, and worked on the morning crossword puzzle. What nobody knew was that before retiring, he'd spent 40 years teaching music at the city's most prestigious university. That particular morning was no different, except that Maya's humming was a bit louder than usual. She'd woken up to find her grandmother humming the same Chopin nocturne she used to play at bedtime, and the melody had stuck with her all morning. As she refilled Mr. Lee's coffee cup, the complex tune flowed naturally from her lips, her muscle memory translating what would have been finger movements into gentle notes. Mr. Lee's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. He knew this piece intimately, had taught it countless times over his long career. But what caught his attention wasn't just the choice of music, unusual enough in a diner, but the technical precision in Maya's humming. Every trill, every delicate run of notes, every subtle change in tempo was exactly as it should be. This wasn't someone who just heard the piece. This was someone who knew it in their bones. "That's Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major," he said quietly, watching Maya's face. "Opus 9, number 2. The coffee pot trembled slightly in Maya's hand before she steadied it. "Oh, I just heard it somewhere," she mumbled, turning to leave. "No," Mr. Lee said gently. "I don't think you did. Those ornamentations you included, they're not in the basic sheet music. They're performance choices, usually only taught at an advanced level." Maya's eyes met his, and for a moment, the busy diner seemed to fade away. In that brief connection, Mr. Lee saw something he recognized, the look of someone carrying music in their soul with nowhere to let it out. "I used to teach at the conservatory," he continued, his voice soft but clear. "Those halls were full of talented young musicians, but I haven't heard anyone hum with such understanding of the piece in a long time." A crash from the kitchen broke the moment. Maya quickly excused herself, disappearing behind the counter. But Mr. Lee noticed how she moved, with the same precise rhythm she'd used in humming the nocturne. Everything about her spoke of musical training, the way she balanced her serving tray, the timing of her steps between tables, even the graceful way she poured coffee. Over the next hour, he watched her more carefully. He saw how she unconsciously conducted with her free hand when the radio played classical music, how her fingers tapped out piano fingerings on her notepad while waiting for orders. The mystery of this musically gifted waitress tugged at his teacher's heart. During the mid-morning lull, Uncle Joe stopped by Mr. Lee's table. "Noticed you watching our Maya," he said, refilling the coffee cup. "She's something special, isn't she?" Mr. Lee nodded thoughtfully. "There's a story there." "Been wondering about that myself for 3 years," Uncle Joe replied, glancing at Maya as she expertly handled a demanding customer with gentle patience. "Sometimes I catch her looking at that piano like it holds all the answers to questions she's afraid to ask." The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. To Mr. Lee, they looked like musical notes floating freely, waiting to be caught and arranged into something beautiful. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts, people he'd known during his long career in music, people who might understand what he was seeing here. Maya passed by again, this time humming a different piece. A challenging run from a Mozart sonata. Mr. Lee smiled to himself. In all his years of teaching, he'd learned that talent had its own way of surfacing, like water finding its path to the ocean. Sometimes it just needed a little help clearing the way. It was one of those rare, quiet afternoons when the lunch rush had ended, but the dinner crowd hadn't yet begun. Rain tapped gently against the diner's windows, keeping most customers away. Maya moved through the empty tables, straightening salt shakers and refilling sugar dispensers, while Uncle Joe dozed in his office doing paperwork. The piano sat in its corner, dusty keys catching the gray afternoon light. For weeks now, ever since Mr. Lee had recognized her humming, Maya had felt his pull growing stronger. Each day, the weight of unplayed music grew heavier in her chest, like a held breath waiting to be released. She glanced around the empty diner. Even the kitchen was quiet. The cook had stepped out for supplies. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the distant hum of traffic. Maya's fingers tingled with a familiar yearning. "Just one piece," she whispered to herself, moving toward the piano as if in a dream. "Just to remember how it feels." The wooden bench creaked softly as she sat down, adjusting it with the automatic movements of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. For a moment, she simply sat there, breathing in the scent of aged wood and memories. Then, slowly, she placed her fingers on the cool ivory. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the air. Hesitant at first, like a bird testing its wings after a long time in a cage. But muscle memory is a powerful thing. Soon, the music flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing. The piece built gradually, growing from gentle raindrops to a storm of emotion. Maya's body swayed with the music, her eyes closed, lost in the intricate dance of melody and harmony. This was the piece she'd been preparing for her final recital, before life had taken an unexpected turn. Every note carried the weight of dreams put aside, of choices made for love rather than ambition. So absorbed was she in the music that she didn't notice the door chime tinkling. A couple seeking shelter from the rain stepped in, then stopped, transfixed. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. Another customer came in, then another. They all stood silently, afraid to break the spell. Uncle Joe emerged from his office, drawn by the music. He stood in the doorway, watching Maya pour her heart into every note. Mr. Lee, who had arrived somewhere in the middle of the piece, stood near the back, his eyes glistening with tears of recognition, not just of the music, but of the raw talent and emotion behind it. The final notes resonated through the diner, hanging in the air like suspended crystals. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then the spell broke with the sound of applause. Maya's eyes flew open. The diner, empty when she'd started playing, now held a small crowd. Phones were out, recording. Mrs. Kumar was dabbing her eyes with a napkin. The construction workers stood in their muddy boots, their usual rowdiness replaced by awe. And Mr. Lee was beaming like a proud father. Color flooded Maya's cheeks as she stood quickly, smoothing her apron with shaking hands. But before she could retreat to the kitchen, she caught sight of Uncle Joe's face. He wasn't surprised, wasn't angry about her impromptu performance. Instead, he was smiling that knowing smile of his, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Well," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "looks like we finally found our evening entertainment." Someone in the crowd laughed, breaking the tension. Questions started flying. Where did she learn to play? Why was she working in a diner? When could they hear more? Maya stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but feeling lighter than she had in years. The music that had been building up inside her had finally found its way out, like a river breaking through a dam. And somehow, instead of the catastrophe she'd feared, it felt like the beginning of something new. Mr. Lee stepped forward, his phone already in his hand. "My dear," he said quietly, "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation about your future." Word spread quickly in their small community. By the next morning, the video of Maya's performance had made its way through local social media groups and neighborhood chats. The morning rush at the diner was busier than usual, filled with curious faces trying to catch a glimpse of the waitress with magical hands. Uncle Joe had given Maya the morning off, insisting she needed time to process everything. But by lunchtime, she was back, drawn to the familiar comfort of the diner. As she tied her apron, she could feel the weight of unasked questions in the air. "My grandmother taught me to play," she finally told Mrs. Kumar, who had been quietly sipping her tea for over an hour, clearly waiting for the story. "She was my first teacher. Used to say music was the best way to speak when words weren't enough." The old woman nodded, understanding flowing between them. Soon, other regulars gathered around, and the story spilled out like notes from a long-held cord. Maya had been a scholarship student at the conservatory, her talent opening doors that her family's modest means couldn't. Her grandmother, who had given up her own musical dreams during harder times, had been her biggest supporter. Every weekend, Maya would take the bus home to give free piano lessons to her younger brothers, determined that music would be part of their lives too. "Then my dad got sick," she said quietly, absently folding and refolding a napkin. "It happened so fast. One day, he was helping me move my piano into the practice room at school, and the next—" She paused, the memory still fresh. Medical bills piled up. Mom took on extra shifts at the hospital, but it wasn't enough. The construction workers, who usually rushed through their lunch break, sat quietly, their coffee growing cold. One of them removed his hard hat, holding it respectfully as Maya continued. When Dad passed, Grandma's health took a turn too. The boys were still in school, Mom was working herself to exhaustion, and someone had to be there. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She smiled softly, remembering the day she'd packed up her dorm room, carefully wrapping the framed photo of her first recital. Mr. Lee, who had been listening from his usual corner table, finally spoke up. "But you never stopped playing in your heart, did you? I could hear it in your humming, and the way you move." Maya shook her head. Couldn't afford to keep the piano. "But the music, it stays with you, you know. Like riding a bicycle or swimming. Your body remembers." Uncle Joe appeared from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. 3 years, he said, pouring refills. 3 years I watched you jump every time someone touched that piano. Should have said something sooner." "Wouldn't have made a difference," Maya replied. "The boys needed me. Grandma needed me. Still do." A young mother who often came in with her toddler spoke up. "My sister teaches piano at the community center. She's always saying how they need more instructors for the afternoon programs. And the music school downtown," added Mr. Lee, his eyes twinkling. "They're quite flexible with scheduling. I might know a few people there." The lunch crowd grew larger as regular customers brought friends who'd seen the video. Each person who walked through the door seemed to carry not just their order, but a piece of possibility. Someone mentioned their church needed a pianist for Sunday services. Another knew of a studio that offered evening lessons. Maya moved between tables, taking orders and refilling drinks, but something had shifted. Each step felt lighter, as if sharing her story had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The music in her head, which had been a bittersweet companion for so long, now felt like a friend waiting to be reunited. As the afternoon sun filled the diner, she caught her reflection in the window, still in her waitress uniform, but standing a little straighter, moving with a new sense of purpose. Sometimes, she realized, life's most important songs take unexpected turns before finding their way back to the melody. The diner buzzed with energy on a warm Saturday morning, but it wasn't just the usual breakfast crowd. Handmade posters covered the windows, announcing the Golden Cup Music Fund in colorful letters. The construction workers had arrived early, setting up extra chairs they'd borrowed from the community center. "You really don't have to do this," Maya told Uncle Joe for the 100th time, watching him rearrange tables to create more space. But her protests were met with his familiar knowing smile. "Honey, when the whole neighborhood comes together like this, you learn to just say thank you and get out of the way," he replied, adjusting his bow tie, something none of his employees had ever seen him wear before. The idea had started small. Mrs. Kumar had mentioned it to her bridge club, who talked to the local business association, who reached out to the community center. Before anyone knew it, the entire neighborhood had embraced the mission of helping their musical waitress find her way back to her dreams. Mr. Lee had been busy too. His old contacts from the music world were intrigued by the viral video of Maya playing Rachmaninoff in her waitress uniform. "Raw talent like that doesn't come along every day," one of his former colleagues had said. And her story, well, that's something special. The bell above the door chimed continuously as people streamed in. The young mother who'd mentioned her sister's piano school had brought the entire staff. The construction workers invited their families. Even the grumpy businessman who always complained about his eggs shook up, checkbook in hand. Maya's own family sat in a corner booth, her mother finally taking a day off from the hospital, her grandmother in her wheelchair beaming with pride, and her teenage brothers trying to act cool but failing to hide their excitement. They'd been skeptical when the community first started rallying around Maya, worried about getting their hopes up. But seeing the diner filled with familiar faces, all there to support their sister, had changed their minds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Uncle Joe called out, standing near the piano. "Most of you know Maya as the girl who keeps your coffee cups full and remembers exactly how you like your eggs. But last week, we've all discovered she's been hiding something pretty special from us." The crowd chuckled warmly. Maya felt her cheeks flush as she stood in her usual spot behind the counter, still wearing her apron. "Today," Uncle Joe continued, "we're not just here for breakfast. We're here because sometimes life gives you a second chance to do right by someone who's done right by all of us. Mr. Lee stepped forward, holding up a folder. The music school downtown has offered Maya a position teaching evening classes, he announced. And the community center has morning slots available for private lessons. A ripple of approval went through the crowd. Then Mrs. Kumar's daughter, an accountant, stood up with a spreadsheet. She'd worked out the numbers between the teaching positions, weekend performances at the diner, and the fund they were starting today. Maya could cut back her waitressing hours and still help support her family. But that's not all, Uncle Joe said, his voice growing soft. Show her, boys. The construction workers disappeared into the back room and returned wheeling something covered with a sheet. Maya's hands flew to her mouth as they pulled the fabric away, revealing a beautiful upright piano. Not brand new, but well-loved and recently restored. The whole street pitched in, explained the head construction worker, rubbing his neck shyly. Found it at an estate sale. My cousin's a piano tuner. He fixed it up nice. It's for your family's apartment. Tears rolled down Maya's cheeks as she walked over to the instrument. Her fingers trembled as she touched the polished wood, remembering the piano she had to sell 3 years ago. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't say anything, Uncle Joe replied gently. Just play for us. Play what's in your heart right now. Maya sat down at the new piano, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. People she'd served coffee to, shared stories with, brightened mornings for. As her fingers found the keys, she began to play something new, a melody that spoke of gratitude, of community, of dreams reborn. 6 months later, the golden cup had transformed into something unique. The morning sun still brought the regular breakfast crowd, but now they came as much for the music as for the coffee. The old piano in the corner had become the heart of the diner, and Maya's music filled the air like the warm scent of fresh-baked bread. On this particular Sunday afternoon, every table was full. Families lingered over their desserts, children sat cross-legged on the floor near the piano, and even the kitchen staff peeked out whenever they could. Maya's weekend concerts had become a neighborhood tradition. Ready for your order? She asked a new customer, notepad in hand. She still wore her waitress uniform, but now a small musical note pin sparkled on her collar, a gift from her students at the community center. Actually, the customer replied, I came to hear you play. My daughter takes lessons at the music school where you teach. She can't stop talking about her amazing piano teacher. Maya smiled, remembering the shy 7-year-old who'd been afraid to touch the piano keys just a few weeks ago. Now the girl played Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star with growing confidence. She's doing wonderfully, Maya said. She has real talent. The afternoon light streamed through the windows as Maya made her way to the piano. Her grandmother sat in her usual spot nearby, her health improving steadily now that the family's financial stress had eased. Maya's brothers were there too. One had started taking guitar lessons, while the other discovered a passion for drums. Their mother watched from behind the counter, where she'd started helping out on weekends, her hospital schedule now more manageable. Uncle Joe stood in his familiar spot, pretending to do paperwork, but really just soaking in the atmosphere of his transformed diner. The regulars had their favorite seats. Mrs. Kumar by the window, the construction workers at their long table, Mr. Lee in his corner with a stack of sheet music he was always eager to share. Today's piece, Maya announced, her voice clear and confident, is something new. I wrote it for all of you. Her fingers touched the keys, and a melody began to flow. One that spoke of morning coffee and friendly faces, of dreams set aside and found again, of a community that had become family. The music started simply, like the first customers arriving for breakfast. Then it grew more complex, weaving in fragments of classical pieces she used to play, along with hints of the pop songs her teenage students loved. There were echoes of the diner's daily rhythms, the clinking of cups, the sizzle of the grill, the chime of the door's bell. As she played, Maya thought about how life sometimes takes unexpected turns. 3 years ago, she'd thought her music was over, locked away with her old dreams. But here she was, creating something entirely new, a life that combined everything she loved. The construction workers had helped renovate a corner of the diner into a proper music area. Local artists had painted musical notes on the walls. The community center had started a scholarship fund for young musicians, inspired by Maya's story. Even the grumpy businessman had surprised everyone by signing up for beginner piano lessons. The final notes of Maya's composition faded into applause. She stood, bowing slightly as she'd done in concert halls years ago. But this felt different. Better. This wasn't just performance, it was sharing a piece of her heart with people who had helped her find her way back to music. That was beautiful, Uncle Joe said, his voice gruff with emotion. Just like every Sunday. No, Maya replied, looking around at the familiar faces that had become so dear to her. Today was special. Today, I finally found the right notes to say thank you. As the afternoon sunlight painted golden patterns on the diner's floor, Maya returned to serving coffee and clearing tables. But now her movements were accompanied by the soft conversations of people planning next week's concert, children begging for piano lessons, and the constant, gentle reminder that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. In the end, Maya hadn't had to choose between her responsibilities and her passion. Instead, she'd found a way to blend them into something uniquely her own. A symphony of coffee cups and piano keys, of duty and dreams, of old songs and new beginnings.